Shogun's rerun is coming up later this patch, and her return got me thinking about the Inazuman roster. We have quite a few solid characters here. Kazuha, Kukishinobu, Toma, and of course Raiden herself. Yet, I also realized that there are quite a few Inazuman units who are less than stellar by today's meta standards. So today, I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at the less powerful units that are a part of the Inazuman roster, evaluate how mid or solid they really are, and then conclude whether the overall Inazuman roster is good or not. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. Something important before we begin. When I say that I'm gonna look at the Inazuman roster, I mean characters that are specifically from Inazuma. So even though Chiori lives in Fontaine, she is from Inazuma, so I will talk about her. This also means that characters like Shenhe, Yunjin, and Yolan who came out during the Inazuma era won't be discussed in this video, because they aren't quote-unquote Inazuma characters if we take the phrasing very literally. Those characters are all pretty good anyway, so they wouldn't have made it into the video either way. Plus, I mostly want to focus on the mid parts of the roster for the majority of this video. So characters that are obviously good like Kazuha and Kuki aren't gonna be talked about because they are all neat units. At the end of the video, I will compare the amount of mid Inazuman units to the amount of good ones, and we will see whether there are more good units in Inazuma than mediocre ones. Then from there, we can draw conclusions as to whether the Inazuman roster is truly good, bad, or somewhere in between. Alright, now that we're all on the same page, let's get started. Itto's always been an interesting case to me, because this character's kit isn't inherently the problem. When he came out, his damage numbers were actually quite satisfying, especially if you went the extra mile with him investment-wise. He held up pretty well for Inazuma's prime time and introduced a unique playstyle while still having a balanced amount of drawbacks. He was also received pretty positively for some other reasons, such as regenerating energy during his burst, unlike Xiao, who could not gain energy during his. So, where did things all go wrong? Simple. Hoyoverse never updated his build and teams to keep with the times. Back in 2.3, our selection of DPSs was a lot smaller, and Dendro hadn't come out yet. Geo was actually in an even worse state back then, but there was promise for the element as Goro had been added alongside Itto as a dedicated Geo buffer. People felt that his raw numbers made up for him having to play with a whole bunch of Geos, so he survived the rest of Inazuma pretty comfortably. Yet when the 3.x era came along introducing Dendro into the game, Itto was almost instantly forgotten. Geo got a whopping amount of 0 concessions with Dendro, despite being the element that absolutely needed the help the most. It's not like it would have been hard to come up with a name for a potential Geo-Dendro reaction anyways. Like, come on dude, just call it Soil or something. The more good Dendro teams that we got, the less and less that Itto was relevant. It didn't help that other carries came out during Sumeru's time as well, which outperformed Itto by quite a bit. For example, Wanderer was pretty great when he came out, and he's still quite good even now. I'm still salty that he goes bold when you press his skill though. Anyways, Sumeru made 0 Geo supports and completely ignored the element. Fontaine didn't help either as the region only continued to pump out DPS after DPS that ignored Itto and tended to newer kits and playstyles. Shoot, you know why Navi is so good? Because she goes against the precedent that characters like Itto set up for Geo. She's an attack scaling, crystallized loving unit that adores having non-Geo teammates by her side. That's also excluding the fact that Navi's DPS is simply just a lot higher than his. It also kinda sucks that Itto has no real consistent form of healing in his teams that can keep up with Farina. Sure, Goro C4 has some heals, but it's definitely not enough to keep up with consistent fanfare generation. As we all know, basically every character in the game got buffed by Farina. Literally everybody. There are very few units that didn't benefit from Farina in some way, shape, or form. Yet it feels like Hoyoverse constantly goes specifically out of their way to design perfect supports that will work with literally every character except good old Arataki Itto. Like, sheesh, what did the guy do to you? Chiori was added into the game in 4.5 to be fair. She did help Itto out by quite a lot and actually rose the DPS of Itto's teams to a somewhat acceptable amount. Still crazy that Itto went essentially over 2 years without getting any kind of buffs though. With that being said, even if you give Itto a Chiori to play with, he's still generally not worth playing over other much stronger main DPS characters. Kachina's C4 works with Itto teams as well, so you'd think this would finally be a win, right? No, not really. This is because you need to react in order to proc Cinder City, but Itto likes mono Geo teams. You know, 4 Geos. So you'd have to replace Goro with Bennett in order to have something for Kachina to crystallize. Which is a wild shame if your Goro is C6, because that's such a waste of a perfectly good Goro. It's essentially an opportunity cost issue, which, to explain what that means, it's kind of the same feeling when you have a really tasty chocolate cake in front of you, but you can only eat half of it, because you're too full to finish the rest. It's a real shame having to waste it and throw it out without finishing it. Itto indeed goes into the mid category, sorry dude. Yoimiya is a case of simply having way too much competition to be worth using anymore. Yes, Yunjin was a pretty cool buff to her, but that was way back in 2.4. This is pretty much another case of the character got kind of abandoned after a certain point. When Yoimiya had first come out, she was actually incredibly controversial because everybody thought she was pretty garbage. The character had a ton of flaws gameplay-wise and was pretty buggy, plus it felt like you barely yielded any DPS out of her. In fairness, Hoyoverse has patched up many of her bug-related issues, but that didn't necessarily save her power level. Yunjin gave everyone hope for the character, and Yolan provided her a Hydra support that worked very well for her specific deliberate vape timings. For some time, she actually did pretty competitive damage once Yolan had come to save the day. But that said, time didn't last very long, since once again, Denjo came along and reared its vegetarian head. Cue the same tragic fate that occurred to Itto, except it's even worse for Yoimiya because she has been completely and utterly replaced in every way possible. Hu Tao Plunge, Linnea in general, Arlecchino in general, you get the idea. You can't even make an ease of use argument because characters like Nervalette also have plenty of that while doing tons more DPS. Even playing a complicated character badly gets you a better clear than playing Yoimiya well. I don't really have a problem with her being single target locked, because the Abyss is super boss and 2 target centric anyway, with Theater also having boss stages. My problem is more so that her damage is, yeah, definitely a mid character. I'm gonna discuss Heizou briefly because let's be real, there isn't much to say about this character other than he had a great hangout. Otherwise, the fact that there isn't much to say should speak for itself. He is a by the numbers 4-star animo DPS that is really not that impressive. Most modern 5-star characters, if not all, will out DPS him simply by sneezing in the direction of the enemy, and the most that Buddy can do is some alright animo numbers. Heizou seriously is just the definition of I exist, I think. And the dude's main claim to fame is that one insane birthday art of his. Never forget, folks, never forget. His one other use case is acting as a Sucrose replacement because he can give your whole team a flat amount of 80 EM while also being able to hold 4VV. But at that stage, literally why are you not just using Sucrose? As for Driver Heizou, give that license to literally anybody else and they could probably drive that team a lot better. Heizou is mid. Shocker. Moving on. Sayu is very much, I exist because Farina exists. Take Farina out of the equation, and suddenly you're never gonna want to use Sayu outside of road raging in the overworld. Her healing is pretty good and she can hold 4VV, Sayu is by no means useless. But even if she does work as a Farina healer, I basically never hear anybody tell me that they actively use her. Plus, Jean, her direct 5-star upgrade, was recently free from the standard 5-star selector. So if somebody needed a unit that has Sayu's qualities, then they would have picked Jean already, because she can do what Sayu does better, and she can also do other things on top of that. Once again, we're in a scenario where we're dealing with a very nothing character. I think she's fine, honestly, but the existence of 50 billion better replacements for her kinda heavily negates her overall value in my opinion. A mid unit, but in fairness, she does have her uses. She is a cutting edge of getting replaced by C0 4-star. Chiori works in 2 places. One is a best in slot unit for Itto teams, which it's Itto, we've already discussed that whole can of beans, and secondly is with Navia. The thing is, Kachina replaces Chiori thanks to 4-piece Cinder City. Kachina's C1 sucking in Crystallized Shards is also pretty neat for Navia, and Kachina can provide all of her value at level 1 with +0 artifacts. Meanwhile, Chiori gets beaten by her at C0 R1. Yes, I said R1, which is a big boost to Chiori, so a C0 R0 Chiori is a decent bit worse for Navia teams than a C0 Cinder City Kachina. Jews, stop bat-chesting Kachina, she sucks. No, she doesn't. I don't care if her actual kit doesn't buff. The matter of the fact is that Kachina's Cinder City buffing is equal to a 1000 DM Kazuha, and she forms both Navia and Nervalette's current best in slot teams for essentially 0 resin cost. I don't care how she achieves those means, the matter of the fact is that she achieves those means. And because of that, Chiori is fairly irrelevant. Kachina sent her into early retirement. Credit where credit is due though, Chiori did get the new Natlan craftable sword as a fresh free-to-play option. DPS Chiori is also equal to a DPS Itto before Chiori. So yeah, not very good. She's never at her peak potential of Navia anyway if you don't have her C1, because she wants Geo constructs to significantly improve her sub DPS, and Navia's teams are almost always constructless. I also wouldn't be surprised to see Shilonen replace even more of Chiori's slot-ins, seeing as Hoyo is always so unkind to Chiori's meta value. She was mid when she came out, and even if Natlan did help her out a decent bit, I'd say she's still not very good. To the coal mines she goes. It's kind of sad that Ayaka fell off so hard, because I really like this unit and I love her playstyle too. Ayaka is definitely one of the better units on this list, but she did fall off too. Modern Fontaine DPSs made her previously very impressive damage output look not so spectacular anymore. For example, Nervalet Freeze is undeniably the strongest freeze team as of now if you're only looking at pure DPS numbers. Ayaka is also pretty expensive to play at a level that feels strong nowadays. A Kageuchi Ayaka felt way better back in the day than it does now, and since Abyss is so boss-centric, teams like this don't really have much staying power anymore. You pretty much always want to play something that looks like this. Cryo has also been in a generally rough spot meta-wise for some time now. It feels like Hoyoverse has pretty much ignored it ever since they first killed it off near the end of Inazuma, which was not long after the Eternal Ayaka banner, funnily enough. Also, Shen has been gone for millennia at this point. I don't know if she's coming back, guys. Did she go to buy milk or something? Ayaka would be the easiest of these characters to bring back. Make Freeze and Cryo relevant again, and Hoyo could perhaps even consider exploring potential new teammates for her. She did get Ayaka, Farina, Kazuha, Charlotte during Fontaine, which is nice. Main issue is that if you managed to snag a Shenhe before she went extinct, where does she go? A Shenhe that could heal would be a pretty good solution, but that'd mean having to ban a Shenhe to the Chronicled Witch banner because of direct power creep. I'm kinda sad that she fell off. She's certainly nowhere near as good as she was during her prime time, but if I'm being completely honest, I'm okay with her being mid, ultimately speaking. Ayaka absolutely had her era in the spotlight, and I see no reason to be upset about her retirement when she's already long since served her purpose. Plus, she's also a lot better than the likes of Yoimiya and Itto in my opinion at the very least. Ayato's actually pretty neat in theater because he can adapt to the nonsense pretty well. Aside from that, my main issue with Bro has always been that he's just not best in slot anywhere, and you also can't justify pulling him when we have every other 5-star Hydro in the game that we currently do. He is a jack of all trades, master of none. Pretty much every other Hydro vastly outperforms him in whatever teams you'd be using him in. He wasn't even all that impressive when he came out because he had Ayaka to live up to, who during Inazuma was literally a top meta character in the way that Nervalet currently is today. Ayato never really peaked, and simply only continuously got worse and worse ever since he first came out. With Nervalet running around the place, it's extremely hard to justify getting Ayato in 2024, especially when the Hydro Dragon also has ease of use on his side. Regulars know fully well how I feel about this character's meta position. He offers basically nothing of value, and I don't know why you'd ever willingly choose him over the other characters unless it's for Imaginarium Theater, where you need a crap ton of characters to fill out your theater roster anyway. Mid for sure, nothing much else to add here. With all that being said, since every character I talked about is either average or below average, that'd mean that Inazuma has a bad roster, right? Let's not jump to conclusions just yet, because there's 2 more hoops we need to jump through in order to confirm this. First off, do the characters of the roster compensate for the bad? And second off, how good or bad is Inazuma's roster in comparison to the full roster of every other region? Let's start with point number 1. Decent Inazuma characters include Raiden Shogun and Yaemiko. Good Inazuma characters include Kuki Shinobu and Toma. S-tier Inazuma characters include Kazuha. Both Raiden and Yai have been power cramped, Kuki is still quite good, Toma keeps progressively getting better, and Kazuha remains as a top 5 meta character even to this day. Kazuha is the real kicker here. He single-handedly raises the value of the roster so much. Raiden is quite nice for new players or anybody who values ease of use, and just because Chloriander is better than Yai doesn't mean that the Fox Lady can't competently handle herself. Yai is still pretty decent in the Abyss, and is still best in slot in Tighnari spread. Kuki enabling Farina for Alhaitham is a pretty big deal, even if that's not my preferred Alhaitham team, and Toma recently got better with Muol on his release. I'm not sure if he's gonna work with Kinich yet, but the theories about how he could potentially work with him that I've heard down below in the comments sound pretty promising. I don't know if it's fair to say that Skara is an Inazuman because of the weird world mind reset thing. I'm gonna say no because he has a Sumeru vision, meanwhile somebody like Chiori has an Inazuma vision, and Toma, somebody who was born in Mondstadt, has an Inazuma vision. So, do these 5 good characters manage to make up for the 7 mid characters in the roster? After all, 7-12 leans more on the side of Inazuma's roster being mid, right? Well, this is where the second point comes in, because in order to complete the first point, we need to see whether 7-12 is a natural amount of mid units to have compared to other rosters, and we have to see whether the quality of Inazuma's good units is better or worse than the good units of other nations' rosters. Mondstadt. The bad characters hit much lower lows than Inazuma's worst, but their highest highs are some of the best characters in the game. Mondstadt pretty much has nearly no in-betweens, with Venti, Noelle, and Diluc being pretty much the only characters that you could consider as in-betweens. I feel like Mondstadt and Inazuma are equal, because Mondstadt has Fischl and Bennett, which are massive W's. Jean too. Liyue, pretty great roster. Its mid-characters are on average better than Inazuma's mid-characters, and Liyue's highest highs can also be very, very good. Xingqiu, Xiangling, and Xianyan, the Triple X trio, are all extremely great characters. We can make that quadruple X of Xiao, who's a very high-tier Anemo DPS at the moment. I'd say that Liyue's roster beats Inazuma's on the whole. Most of the Sumeru units that used to be bad got buffed quite nicely, and Dendro characters on the whole are pretty consistent, so you know what to expect out of them. The worst here are equally as mid as Inazuma's worst, I'd say, but all of these guys are alright. Fontaine has the best roster in the game in my opinion, as there's literally only 2 characters here that are whatever. Everybody else is either good, great, or peak meta. Inazuma's roster wishes it could be Fontaine's roster. And finally, Natlan's roster is far too small for us to meaningfully include it in this specific debate. But for those of you who are curious about my opinions on Natlan's current roster in general, seems pretty promising so far. Can't wait for Moth Ika to come out and hopefully buff units such as Mualani and Kinich, the way that Nihida and Farina massively buffed the units that came out before them. So, is Inazuma's roster mid on the whole? In my opinion, unfortunately, yes. I don't think that the good characters of the region save the roster because Kazuha is the only true Inazuma in S tier. All other nations have way more potential S tier and A tier units, and I'd say the only nation that comes close to being equally as mid as Inazuma is Mondstadt's cast, because they have some questionable units. With that being said, this doesn't mean that I think you should never pull for any Inazuma unit if you want them. Ooh, no more Inazuma units! This is more so something interesting that I happened to notice and wanted to share with you all with a more in-depth discussion of the topic. I do think that Fontaine did raise the standards by quite a bit, and plenty of Inazuma's characters were at least good for their time. These units are all still serviceable. Naturally, play who you want. I'm still a freaking Venti and Ganyu fan in good old 2024. With that being said, let me know about your thoughts on the matter down below in the comments. Maybe you think I'm right, or completely and utterly wrong. Either way, let me know what you think. Hopefully this video was able to give you some food for thought regarding how good Inazuma's roster actually is in the current day era of Genshin Impact. This has been Juice, signing out, and this is kind of off topic, but they added a chocolate recipe to Genshin Impact. I love chocolate.